Most people don't experience moral panic firsthand. They experience it through repetition, through headlines, clips, stories repeated so often they begin to feel like reality. Think about the Satanic Panic. A handful of accusations became national news, repeated constantly until people started seeing a hidden threat everywhere. Or think about a viral clip today. One video, one headline, one story, and suddenly something statistically rare can start feeling socially overwhelming. Not because people personally investigated the issue deeply, but because repetition changes perception, and modern media is built around repetition. Because media does not need to invent fear to amplify it. It only needs to repeat fear often enough that people begin organizing their understanding of the world around it. And once that happens, society starts reacting to not just reality, but perceived reality. A fascinating thing about humans is we rely on mental shortcuts. We have to. There is simply too much information competing for our attention. So the brain looks for patterns, familiarity, emotional signals, repeated ideas. And one of the most powerful psychological effects is simple exposure. The more often people hear something, the more normal and believable it begins to feel. Not necessarily because it is true, but because familiarity creates comfort, and comfort creates a feeling of legitimacy. This affects everyone, every ideology, every political movement, every community. Humans are heavily influenced by repetition, especially emotionally charged repetition, because emotionally memorable information sticks far more easily than nuanced information. And modern media environments are extremely good at creating emotional memory. This is one of the reasons moral panic spreads so effectively. Emotionally vivid stories overpower statistics. One dramatic clip, one frightening headline, or one viral moment, and suddenly millions of people start associating an entire group with that single example, even when that example itself is statistically rare. Psychologists call this the availability heuristic. The brain estimates how common something is based on how easily examples come to mind. And media repetition constantly supplies emotionally memorable examples. Because humans don't experience statistics. We experience stories. And stories shape perception far faster than data ever will. Especially when fear, morality, or children become attached to the narrative. Because emotional stories spread. Nuance usually doesn't. And attention is not frequency. Just because something dominates attention does not mean it dominates reality. Modern media runs on attention. Clicks, shares, comments, watch time, and attention is valuable. Fear holds attention. Conflict also holds attention. And outrage holds attention. A calm headline rarely spreads faster than an alarming one. And importantly, this does not require some giant conspiracy. It is often just incentive structures. Media companies compete for attention. Social platforms reward engagement. Algorithms amplify emotionally reactive content because people interact with it more. And over time, This creates an information environment where emotionally charged stories become far more visible than ordinary reality. Not because ordinary reality disappeared, but because ordinary reality rarely goes viral. Fear does, conflict also does, and outrage definitely does. One of the most powerful effects of moral panic is symbolic thinking. Groups stop being viewed as individuals and start being viewed as symbols of larger fears, such as social decline or cultural change, loss of control, threats to children, threats to morality. And once people become symbols, nuance becomes much harder. Because the conversation is no longer fully about actual people. It becomes about what society projects onto them. This is why groups throughout history are often described in exaggerated ways during periods of panic. Not because most people have deeply studied those groups, but because symbolic fear spreads faster than understanding. And media repetition intensifies that process. The group stops feeling like people the audience does not know. It starts feeling like a social problem the audience has repeatedly heard about. This is why people often begin asking things like, why is this suddenly everywhere? But constant exposure does not mean something is suddenly dominant. It means attention has become concentrated around it. If you see 10 stories about the same thing this week, your brain does not naturally ask, how common is this? It tends to ask things like, why is this happening everywhere? Because repeated exposure changes perception. The brain often confuses attention with frequency, and modern media environments create repeated exposure constantly, which means emotionally charged narratives often receive disproportionate visibility compared to their actual prevalence in everyday life. And over time, people stop reacting to isolated stories, they start reacting to the emotional atmosphere those stories create. Because attention is not frequency. Media does not need to create fear from nothing. It only needs to repeat fear often enough that fear begins to feel socially normal. And once emotionally charged narratives dominate public attention, people often stop asking how representative those narratives actually are. Because repetition changes perception, and perception changes society. Not only through lies, sometimes through amplification, selective focus, and emotional repetition. Because what we repeatedly see starts feeling representative. And when something feels representative, we sometimes stop asking how common it actually is. We assume we already know. And that is how repetition quietly reshapes reality. Y'all be well, and I'll see you in the next one.